Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew Weiss. Thank you all so much for joining us here today at the Carnegie Endowment. We're delighted to see such a large turnout for our two very interesting speakers, and I'm going to turn to them in just a moment. Before I do that, let me just put a couple ground rules on the table. This discussion is being live streamed, so I'd appreciate it if people would just make sure that your cell phones are turned to mute. And then we're going to have brief presentations by our two speakers, and I'll ask a few questions, then I'll turn things over to the audience for what I hope will be a very interesting exchange. I only ask that when we begin that part of the discussion that people wait for the microphone so that we can make sure that what you say is heard by the people who are tuning in on the internet. Again, welcome to Carnegie. I'm Andrew Weiss. I'm Vice President for Studies here. It's a great, exciting time for us here at Carnegie. We've just hit the one-year anniversary of our Ukraine Reform Monitor project. The most recent issue was released yesterday. I would encourage everyone to take a look at that. We've been tweeting about it and sending it out through email over the last 24 hours. And we're delighted that the person who's the original idea of this project was Balazs Yarbek, a visiting scholar at the Carnegie Endowment, who's joined us today, visiting from Europe. And one of the key team members, Mikhail Monakov, who's a professor at the Kyiv Academy and a longtime, very prominent Ukrainian analyst and political player, has joined us as well. So anyways, we're going to talk at the beginning. I think we'll turn to Mikhail first about the challenges that Ukraine faces during this period of considerable domestic uncertainty in light of the new government that took power just a few weeks ago, and then to Balazs, and then begin a conversation. So anyways, welcome to Carnegie, both of you. Mikhail, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest to Ukraine, and I will do my best to speak, like a scholar, but I'm also a proud citizen of my country, and if I self-censored myself, you can always then raise a question and ask me. So I'm very glad to report today that our political crisis has ended. It's been going on since December, and for a country that just have started its reform process, this delay with the crisis and the solution of the crisis was too expensive for us. But in the end of the political crisis, now that we resolved it, what we currently have is that Petro Poroshenko, our current president, have increased his control over the cabinet. So Prime Minister and the majority of ministers represent Poroshenko's bloc and his supporters. However, he lessened control over parliament. So parliament is now presided by a National Front MP, and we kind of have rebalancing in Ukraine of powers. At the same time, ex-Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk is now in the shadow of the politics. He kind of took some time to stay away and criticize probably this current government. But at the same time, we definitely see his impact through his party on real politics in Ukraine. So it's not, his era is not finished. And we definitely see another big change in Ukraine, that current opposition is probably the majority in parliament. So basically, the possibilities for current cabinet to make reforms, to implement reforms, and to create new laws is very limited. There is, well, at least formally, there are no majority votes behind the two factions, of the Poroshenko faction and Yatsenyuk faction, that created a new coalition. But there's an ad hoc majority, and the role of small groups, MP groups, parliamentary groups that are controlled by old oligarchs or young oligarchic groups is increasing. So basically, we will see that the role of these rent seekers, big or small, is probably increasing. The price that our leaders paid for the very long crisis is also resembled in the lack of support to current leaders. So basically today, President Poroshenko has very small rating of support. It's only 2% of Ukrainians who strongly support, and 15 just partially supportive of what he's doing. His negative rating is about 58%. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, ex-Prime Minister Yatsenyuk, had only one support of those who really thought that he's doing the right way, and 6% were partially supporting him. And his negative rating, joint negative rating, is -82. Parliament has paid probably the biggest price in losing the trust of citizens. There are basically 0% of those who endorses the behavior of Parliament, and 5% of those who partially approve the work of Parliament. So you see that there's this lack of support to key political institutions. And if I would talk about, for example, support to justice system, it's even worse. So basically, we are back again to the huge demand, the huge hunger of Ukrainians for a new wave of reforms and inability or limited ability of current cabinet to respond to it. So probably we will see another political crisis pretty soon. I think this resolution was very partial, limited, and the new period, the new political season in the fall will be very hot. And before I stop, I would pay attention to opposition issue and the mass media issue. Opposition. Today, the most popular figures like Andriy Sadovy, leader of Samopomich party, Mikhail Saakashvili, and these two figures, they have about 35% of support. Although none of them directly calls himself as a candidate for future president, but these two figures with 35 positive rating behind them, they are very important figures in opposition. Also, Batkivshina and the Yulia Tymoshenko's party and opposition bloc, they become more and more popular as political forces. And one of my advices that the West would pay attention to these two groups and probably establish some additional communication with them, just to, if there is a future new cabinet with these two groups as a future coalition, then the West would have at least some contacts with future Ukrainian cabinet. At the same time, Ukraine needs support from the West also, as in times of Yanukovych, in terms of support to mass media and pro-democracy NGOs. I think we are coming to the moment when presidential power has increased to the level when it's very easy for the presidential vertical to abuse its power and to put a pressure on media. We definitely see in the recent 6 to 5 months that the media situation, the freedom media situation, is not that good. It's deteriorating, and Western support to mass media is important. Also, we have a group of vibrant and strong civil society organizations and coalitions, and they have necessary support from the West, but I look forward for continuation of this support. With the pressure from civil society, government cannot misbehave to the level it used to 5 years ago. I think I will stop now, and I'm eager to respond to your questions.
So part of what we've been doing for the past year, and Balázs has been leading this, has been trying to look at Ukrainian reform through the lens of 4 or 5 key baskets, and to actually assess is progress being made, and then to also get a little more of a sense of how complicated the politics of reform is, and that each of these major reforms requires going after vested interests. And what we've seen, and I think the paper, which I hope folks picked up in front, that Balázs and Mikhail published on Friday, talks about how in the collapse of state institutions, new players are filling the vacuum. And part of what's in this paper that they wrote last week about the hybrid state and the idea that enemies have captured the state is that we're seeing people who are not the old oligarchic groups, the Akhmetovs and the Kolomoiskys, but regional groups that have basically taken advantage of the collapse of state authority. I'm just sort of curious, Balazs, if you could sort of describe that argument a little bit for people here, and then dig deeper on the impact that has on reform and understanding what Poroshenko is doing as the leader. Because it's different, I think, than the narrative of there's this reform and anti-reform, or there's this war. You know, those have been the two main lenses, understandably, that people apply to Ukraine because we have a lot of history and a lot of historical memory. But something very dynamic is happening, actually, that doesn't get captured by that.
Thank you, and first of all, thanks for hosting and having us here. We have been spending a week in DC talking to various government agencies as well as NGOs and implementers working in Ukraine. I think I kind of was surprised that there is a huge interest still toward Ukraine, because people were telling me, oh, you know, like there's going to be a Ukrainian fatigue and fading interest. But I see the interest is huge, but the frustration is perhaps even bigger. So the combination of the two, what I would characterize, both how, you know, the United States government as well as other American stakeholders are looking at Ukraine, and this is very much correspond. How is the situation in Ukraine, as Misha Minyakov was talking about the trust, the reason why we think that this frustration and the reform processes, although ongoing, it doesn't have the necessary impact, is a kind of misunderstanding or a different context. What exactly the Maidan was and what happened after. You know, we have this kind of basic understanding that this was mostly geopolitical. This was a geopolitical choice between Russia and the EU, and this is part of it. But at the same time, you know, what we also have seen of 25 years of rent-seeking corruption has brought down at the Maidan the collapse of the central authority, of the essence of the state was also collapsing in the Maidan over the clashes. And after the Russian aggression, this, you know, the focus has been not turned obviously on reforms, but much more on the war and the Donbass. And this has also hijacked Western audience understanding of what's going on locally. In Kyiv, we wanted to see Ukraine as united, and Ukraine was united when it comes to the Russian aggression. At the same time, very much fragmented, simply because the state is still captured. And what we try to show that the state is not only captured by the old oligarchs, and how much essentially those oligarchy groups, there's a lot of competition, there's a lot of new ones. There is a lot of criminal ones now, since corruption, the criminality is very high, and the illegal activity, just like Amber instruction in Western Ukraine, cigarette smuggling, which is, by the way, $2 billion a year income for someone toward Western Europe. The Amber alone is estimated for about $500 million annually. So we're talking about a huge money in a country which has been experiencing increased and very high poverty rates. Now it's 80%. And you know, the reform efforts from our reading from the very beginning supposed to be A, rebuilding the social contract, and B, rebuilding state institutions, which would be, let's not be idealistic, going to be less captured at least. They're going to be serving more the interest of the public instead of the vested interest around them. Now, this has been a huge task, or would have been even without Russia's steps. And now, obviously, in this kind of geopolitical situation, it is even harder, I believe, simply because our focus is, and you know, I kind of describing that I have been engaged in the past 15 years on the European side to try to change the West focus on the Russia first policy toward the region in between the European Union and Russia. And now I find very unfortunate that we again returning to focusing on Ukraine because of the Russian aggression. At the same time, this focus essentially decreasing our focus and attention on what's going on in Ukraine. And there's a lot going on, and you know, kind of reducing also the Western pressure, which is often very personalized. We have been received questions, oh, we should, you know, keep our eggs into the same basket. Well, this is exactly what we did in Moldova. And our pro-European partners were stealing much more than the Communist Party. Well, go figure. So, you know, this kind of more detailed attention toward what is happening inside of Ukraine, where these financial political groups are the big reality. They are in the parliament. It's one of the reasons why the new government coalition going to have tremendously hard time to move forward reforms in the parliament. And I think one of the reasons why we can, whether we like it or not, forget about the Minsk implementation, simply because it's not going to be possible to gather the 300 necessary votes for any constitutional changes within the circumstances. So this is the kind of the context which I would like to put Ukraine, because I think this is a realistic one. And we hope at Carnegie with these products, what we do essentially, we're raising the attention at the necessary level with that detail which is happening. So a few words about the new government. I personally think, based on a lot of local analysis I have been reading, that the technical competence of the new government is essentially high or even higher than the previous one. I see Yatsenyuk dismissal or essential failure as a good news, simply because he was failed mostly on the reform side. He was considered as one of the limits of the reforms, and also considered, because we cannot really prove, as a new leader of a new financial political group, because his real interest was not necessarily pushing reforms. He was pushing that line in the West. Excellent English speaker, we loved him for that. At the same time, according to certain anecdotal evidence, he's also getting very rich. At the same time, and now he has his own kind of financial political groups around him, and that is what he is going to continue from the background, right? So this government, a few months ago, wouldn't have been possible. Essentially, it's a big victory for Poroshenko because he managed to put a protege of his, Vladimir Groisman, who is considered a very good manager. He was twice elected Vinnytsia mayor. Vinnytsia is a big central Ukrainian town, south central Ukrainian town, one of the best managed towns in the country. Clean, good services. So essentially, he has the credentials, obviously from the regional level, and he's considered to be loyal. So there's gonna be a centralized authority, or central authority, if you like. So if Poroshenko and these folks' main interest is going to be reforms, with the technical competence, they can move reforms forward. And it's a big if. I don't want to go into speculations whether it's going to be happening or not. This is what we're going to watch. But both the technical competence and the loyalty and the central, the vertical, right, as they call it, in Ukraine is going to be there. Now, that raises something else, though, that Poroshenko still didn't move from the position of being an oligarch himself. He is representing not only public interest, but he representing his own vested interest by himself. And I always kind of believed, and watching him from essentially 99 when he entered politics, I also entered Ukraine. So for me, these are very familiar names based on the track record. A lot of people, institutional memories, we are lacking, I think, in the West. So Poroshenko is kind of model is the Kuchma Ukraine, where he was able to be an arbiter of these oligarchy groups. But Kuchma did not become ever an oligarch himself. One of the reasons why his status as a judge or arbiter as a president and the presidential office could be raised into the point was exactly that. The second caveat is that Kuchma was considered authoritarian president, and this is, I believe, and I'm afraid, we are moving with the Poroshenko government as well. Naturally, but by default, because we're talking about the collapse and the rebuild of the central authority, he will have been more authoritarian. And Misha was talking about we already have press freedom issues. A Polish journalist was banned yesterday for 5 years to enter in Ukraine, obviously for a different opinion, right? We're going to see more and more these kind of things. Centralizing the authority, centralizing the opinion, and trying to centralize reforms as well, which this particularly later thing may not be a bad thing actually to move those forward. I'm finishing up. I think the key trend and the key issue in 2016 are going to be privatization. When we have been discussing World Bank, EBRD lately, we've been in London last week, there is a lot of discussion whether this should happen because Ukraine is not ready. Well, the news is, I have a good news for bad news for you. You can choose. This is going to be happening. So the issue is not whether it should be happening, because it will be. The issue is in what kind of conditions it should be happening. What is the role of the state, and the transparency, accountability, making sure that both foreign companies and the local financial political groups are going to competing by equal conditions. There's going to be transparency. So it's essentially going to be the state coffers are going to be enriched and not the local oligarchs. Why privatization is important? Because the biggest source of the rent seekers are the state enterprises, which are captured by these oligarch groups. Ukurnafta, the Kolomoisky controlled. He has a 25% share, 50% of the state, and he Kolomoisky controlling the management doesn't pay dividends to the state. Now it's 20 billion hryvnia, despite Poroshenko's best effort, this money is still not flowing to the government. So privatization, it could be a solution if the Ukrainian government is not able to clean. And so far in the past 2 years, the Ukrainian government, despite its try, was not able to clean of these state enterprises. I think I'm gonna stop here. There is one last point. The parliament, which has been the big troublemaker now, right? And it's nothing going to change until there is going to be a new election law that civil society is pushing for. So it's not going to be a proportional, a much more transparent, which they're suggesting. It's not going to be changing, unfortunately. And everybody is the bad guy who is competing. And, again, everybody has vested interest. Now, the parliament has 0% of trust in Kyiv, in the capital. And the biggest lingering issue beyond the privatization here is the legitimacy of the Ukrainian government. This is something which very much overlooked. We think if Victoria Nuland goes to support the post-Maidan government, essentially is going to increase the legitimacy. It's 0% in Kyiv, the parliament legitimacy. So I think that's one of the reasons why I do want to support Mikhail on we need to keep, because it's a democratic country, we need to keep a contact with everyone. We want to make sure, it's one of the reasons how we can tame the authoritarian tendencies, exactly keeping not all the eggs in one basket, but all, because it's a democratic basket, eggs in every basket to make sure that Ukraine is not going to be Moldova. Thank you.
Mikhail, did you want to respond on a couple of these points?
Just to wrap it up, I was talking mostly about formal institutions, and you were dealing with the informal institutions. But now I would like to finish, to show the bigger picture, joining the both perspectives. So our political development was defined by two competing political agendas since 2014. One was Euromaidan agenda, democratic, pro-European. The other one was war agenda that demanded, disciplined society, disciplined economy that is directed to fight the enemy. And in the clash of these two agendas, we basically see how the clans, oligarchic clans, and the smaller financial political groups re-emerged and increased their power. But today, 2 years after these two agendas were formulated and started clashing with each other, we have the emerging third agenda. And it's the needs of citizens in the regions. These needs are so much unaddressed in the front zone and on the border with EU. But everywhere, the lack of response from the central government was so big. So for so long, we didn't look at Ukrainian regions from Kyiv that I think that's the hot time for Groisman and for President Poroshenko to address them. And I really start worrying about the situation in Kherson Oblast. We definitely see very worrying news from Odessa and Kharkiv. We definitely see how the northern oblasts like Volhynia are out of order more and more, and we cannot control even by deploying big military, police forces there. And also the so-called cigarette republics in Transcarpathia and the Chernovtsi, they are just becoming too and too visible as problems for the political class at all. And the issue of legitimacy is returning now. Kyiv as a capital has to reinforce its legitimacy by addressing and dealing with the economic and social problems we have now.
Could you just so folks understand what's going on in Kherson, just take that example
Yeah.
and explain why it's become so unstable.
Exactly. You probably all heard about these explosions of the electric lines to Crimea. And this international level was actually hiding what is going on Ukrainian side. These three rayons in the southern part of Kherson Oblast. Kherson Oblast is the borderline with Crimea today. And there we have Ukrainian army deployed and several volunteer battalions, Crimea volunteers, Ukrainian volunteers, and probably allegedly,
Tatar volunteers.
Tatar volunteers. Allegedly they were dealing with these explosions. And the local populations was deprived from electricity and water supplies because of with the explosions and anti-Russian activity of these battalions. These days, we see more and more and hear more and more demands from local authorities to deploy more force, police force, in order to control the situation. Local population versus battalions, local population versus this strange situation with explosions. And this is just one of the examples of how Kyiv is not actually delivering to Ukrainian citizens right now in the regions. Or another issue could be what kind of security our rural populations have, even in central Ukraine. We have police reform, and we had a very important visible step with patrol police. But it's major, it was done in big cities. At the same time, we didn't make next necessary steps, changing the investigation and the rural police. And huge parts of Ukrainian population are now just lacking the basic security in everyday life. And Vinnytsia Oblast, the oblast of our president, is in critical situation today because of the rising banditism and criminality in rural areas. So these small things, they are not visible in outside Ukraine. But for us, for citizens, it's probably the best proof of existence of government that they can provide us with basic security.
So let me ask a question about citizen security along the line of contact. And the mood seems to be hardening somewhat in Kyiv about basically let's wall off Donbass and we'll pay lip service to Minsk and our obligations under Minsk, but there is no political will or set of activities that would suggest a pathway for reintegrating the East, even if the best case scenario were to materialize. Can you talk a little bit about the politics of that and the reality along the line?
Yeah, I mean, just also putting it into a broader context, Poroshenko was elected with a peace ticket when he won a landslide 2 years ago, actually almost exactly 2 years ago, going to be 2 years ago now. And because people wanted him to make sure that this Donbass insurgency, whatever, ends, right? And, that time, even the when the second Minsk agreement was signed, 36% of the population supported it. Now it's down to 14. It's clear resistance again since the grenade attack after the first constitutional vote last August. The society, although wants peace, they really because of the information they're receiving, they really think the Minsk agreement is essentially a Russian tool, and it cannot be implemented otherwise. This is a Russian ultimatum which Ukraine or independent Ukraine cannot implement. So what is happening is there's essentially no willingness, political willingness in Kyiv to reintegrate the Donbass based on the Minsk agreement. Now, whether we agree that this is a Russian tool or not, without this political will of reintegrating Donbass, there is going to be a security situation in the border. That's number one. Number two, what we also see, I think, because this is not really based on information since I haven't been there, neither most of the journalists now have no access to, there is a consolidation on the so-called DNR and LNR, all these republics, of a kind of developing a kind of stalemate. Also, 6 rebel leaders were killed in the past year. Over 10 were pulled back, convinced to go away. They did. This is not the work of the Ukrainian counterintelligence. I guess we know who is doing it. This is an ongoing consolidation, which I believe the reason why all the humanitarian organizations and all this were banned. So this work essentially can be done without witnesses. Now, on the contact line, it is over 60,000, almost 70,000 Ukrainian soldiers with some battalions who are clearly not formally integrated into the army, but clearly, if just based on the OC, SMM monitoring reports, are not under command. At the same time, there's 38,000 rebel/Russian or Russian-supported rebel soldiers. So and with a lot of weapons on both sides. So it's a very critical situation, a critical mass of soldiers. Not everybody is under command, neither on the Russian side, neither on the Ukrainian side, and that's one of the reasons why we're seeing this increase of increased violations of the ceasefire. Now, this is 80% based on the OSCE monitoring reports are coming from the rebel side. My interpretation of this is that they're trying to convince Russia to support them. They're trying to resist the consolidation, right, and trying to make sure that they're going to be remaining in charge. Essentially, this is for the current leadership of these so-called republics. It's a life or death situation. So that's why we see so much resistance. But again, until there is no political will to implement the Minsk agreement, that security situation will remain. And the Minsk agreement, in my reading, was always about ceasefire. It was not acceptable it is not acceptable for the current Ukrainian elite. And I don't think any elections essentially would change. There is no reconciliation mood. There is a lot of resistance in the society. There's a lot of fighting. And at this stage, there is no one who would represent politically a reconciliation or reintegration. So I don't think it's going to change. I think our best hope is keeping and making sure that the ceasefire is cemented. There is a demilitarization, which is, by the way, the first 2 points of the Minsk agreement. I think this is where we need to return to first. And the Western pressure on Ukraine is a bit counterproductive because it doesn't take into account the fragile state, the internal frictions, the regional problems of Ukraine, right? So, like by pushing the Ukrainians, it's almost like it's rocking the boat, but the Ukrainian boat may not turn as we wish, but simply sink.
Well, on that optimistic note, let's open things up for discussion. And as I said before, please wait for the microphone, and please make sure that when you ask a question that there's a question mark at the end. Please, you, sir.
Yes, Alexei.
And if you can keep it brief as well, so that as many people as possible get to speak.
Alexei Sepchenko. Could you please elaborate what's going on with the media?
Maybe if you speak a little slower and a little louder.
Could you please elaborate what's going on with the media? Savik Schuster case, this Polish journalist. Who is doing this? Why do they do this? What does it mean in the future?
So the question for folks who couldn't hear it is if the panelists could explain the recent pressures on press freedom. There was a visa ban on Savik Schuster, the popular television journalist, last week or earlier this week, and the Polish journalist case that Balázs mentioned. Do you want to?
Yeah, well, I think this Savik Schuster issue, that was an anchorman of a very popular talk show who was once very important figure for the rise of Poroshenko, and today he is like a public enemy of Poroshenko. Today, his program is ousted from all big channels, and he created his own channel to deliver this show. And all the key opposition figures go there to speak up. But basically, it's like a ghetto for opposition leaders, but also for populists in a way. And Savik Schuster himself is a very mixed figure with very mixed reputation. But whichever reputation there is behind journalists, for us, the lesson that we learned in post-Soviet Ukraine, that whenever there's a pressure against any kind of journalist, it's the pressure that should be responded by civil society, by all opposition and political figures, not to let it happen. The Schuster case is what was like the last week big issue. But in reality, what's happening underneath these scandalous things is much more worrying. There was a wave of certain, a compromise between journalists themselves, how to describe the situation in Crimea, how to describe situation in Donbass on both sides, how to address the issue of IDPs. Later, this compromise was making impact on how critical and open Ukrainian media were about processes in Ukrainian politics. You definitely see that there is some sort of self-censorship happening. And here, no one can make an impact. It's social issue. But then, since October and December last year, I was personally receiving mixed messages from editors-in-chief saying that they receive the so-called temniki, the list of topics from government or from presidential administration. Every time I received this message from them, I asked them to show me in paper so that I could represent it also to media. I'm not afraid to speak it up. Well, but I never received this evidence. So there's words of editors said to me off the records, but I cannot prove them like I can. There's also this new and stronger impact of the Committee on TV and Radio on the content of many programs. And here we definitely see more and more intrusion into the matter of free media and freedom of speech. So it goes on slowly. You know, I forgot who said this, but we usually lose freedoms in very small steps, slowly. And this is what I was noticing, but not only me, Reporters Without Borders, they also raised many issues in their recent reports. Freedom House is putting us not into the camp, into the family of free nations, you know. So the situation is also monitored by external players. So with the freedom of media, we definitely have worsening situation, but it's manageable. Still, we can improve it, but also with the help of our Western friends. Please.
Thank you. Michael Kurtzig, retired economist from the Department of Agriculture. So I'm interested in the figure that you quoted, 80% poverty in the country. Could you put a human figure on that? How many people are we talking about? Number one. And the second question is, how are the people surviving? What is the food situation, resources? Are there any jobs? And it seems to me years ago, we thought of Ukraine as the breadbasket of Russia. Is it now turned into a basket case? Quite the opposite side here. So a little bit more on how the people are surviving under these circumstances. Thank you.
Yeah, the 80% is an official data from the UN. The UN measure it's $5 a day, and that's the level which, you know, much of this obviously, and not that the situation is really dire for a lot of people, but also this is, you know, like we counting in dollars and with a huge depreciation of the value of the local currency. So there is a lot of adaptation possibilities still for the locals, but you know, just like a lot of people, and you know, when there was a scandal with the previous government and the foreign minister, economic minister Abramovicius left, or another one, Pivovarsky, they said we cannot live on $250 salary, right? And you know, I just seen an announcement of a great reform. You know, that finally they selected the top state enterprises, which are not going to be sold, like the post office, and a couple of the railway. You know, there's a very transparent selection of the director. They're going to make over $12,000, right? And the announcement was made by the deputy minister of economy, who was making $280. Like, you know, how we imagine to fight corruption within these circumstances, right? So this is a serious issue. The other things that the Ukrainians, you know, are surviving because everybody has either a cow, a little parcel, they're growing their own things. That is a natural, long, traditional way of surviving. But you know, it's also like my feeling is, particularly if you're going to the region, or you're just going to the sleeping rayons, so-called sleeping rayons of Kyiv, that people's patience are not that thin. It's soon is not going to be, you know, kind of, it's going to be, must be an eruption. I think the government also kind of see that, and you know, at the same time, what the government will do is, I think they will try to renegotiate the IMF to tame the austerity and not necessarily clean the coffers and making a normal subsidies policy, you know, transparent, you know, and so on. When it comes to the agriculture and the breadbasket, I think was a lot of hope that connected to the DCFTA, to the European Union Deep Trade Agreement. And, you know, unfortunately, this hope were not based on real numbers or real situation, I have to say that. For me, we made a special kind of effort to look to all the documents, at least on the EU side. The EU certainly didn't do the calculations, right? The Ukrainian government may have do the calculations. I haven't seen all the documents, and the Ukrainian civil society calculations very optimistic connected to that. And here comes, there are 76 Ukrainian agriculture companies who are using the no tariff policy to import, right? 2/3 of it are honey makers. Now, the first 3 months, they already filled the quota for the whole year. Because one thing is the tariffs, the other thing is the quota. And the EU is not going to let Ukrainian agricultural producers to have too much quota simply because there would be a big fight with the French, the Polish, the Hungarian, and so on and so on farmers, because these are the members of the European Union. So there is a lot of these details, which unfortunately was not taken into consideration. I personally think that Ukrainian economy is going to remain crippled unless it's going to have access to the Russian market. And it's not geopolitics, it's geography. If we taking a look at the map, it is as simple as it is, and particularly also what they produce, and so on and so on and so on. And particularly, this is important for the southeast part of the region. Like we just talk about it, the world from Mariupol, which is 20 kilometers from the front line and to the Russian border, is different. Like, let's say, from even Kyiv, but they're certainly not looking at Slovakia as an example, right, or the market, but they're looking 20 kilometers on the border on the other side. And this is, unfortunately, is helping in this polarization, which is so far not visible, because yes, again, the Ukrainians are united when it comes to the Russian aggression. No, nobody wants to live according to the so-called republics, right? But at the same time, these are common sense things. And here comes the media, the current media environment is so much polarizing. So much you have to accept the central line, right? That it's essentially taming these normal common sense issues as well in many ways, just like who we should trade and where we can sell. So unless there is unless there is a Marshall Plan, which the Ukrainians like to talk about, but this is just not to reindustrialization of those areas like the Donbass and so on. Ukraine economy kind of going to remain in a limbo, and that's kind of going to fuel polarized politics, and the poverty obviously is going to not helping to raise political legitimacy, and support for reforms and so on and so on and so on. So that is the social and economic situation is going to be a main issue of this year, and the privatization of this and so on.
The only footnote I'd put on that is, historically, Ukraine has been a commodity exporting country, particularly with global steel markets depressed, and so you just can't see in the environment we're in where the demand for a lot of Ukraine's most competitive exports is going to be there. But anyways, maybe we just. You want to hop in? Okay.
Also, there's a reaction of society like shadow economy. So, according to the recent assessment of World Bank, shadow economy is 56 or 58%.
Which helps the survival.
Yeah, it means that in the village, there are no money anymore. My parents still live in a small village near Zaporizhia, and how do we react? We survived 90s, so we will survive 2016 as well. But it means that we will plant more potato, more onion, and we'll survive. But this survival will come with a price to political class. And in Kyiv, there is an attempt to address this issue. We have decentralization started. It's now in a stalemate, but there was very important steps already made in terms of financial sustainability of regions. And we are constantly addressing it in our reform assessment. We show how we make this decentralization happen. And there's possibility at the local level to address the most important issues. Almost there. But regretfully, we stopped in December in doing reforms. But in December, there was already the moment when one more step, and we would probably could create in my village another pipeline, a new pipeline. It's now broken since Soviet times. So there was one step from the parliament in need, and we didn't make it. So I expect this year probably small steps will be done, and it will help us to survive as well.
So allow me just one more thing. There's a lot of things that agriculture, the breadbasket, and this is going to be Ukraine's future. This country makes the best engines for rockets, even now. Even now. This is the third biggest airplane making country in the world. Unfortunately,
our IT market is growing.
And where is it? Southeast Ukraine. The southeast, not on the west, the southeast part. So the tremendous industrial, educational potential of these. Unfortunately, we're not going to buy Antonovs because we have the Boeings and, there's not competitive with this. Who is going to buy Antonovs? The West. So it is, like this, although the geopolitical orientation is very important politically, like if Ukraine will only remain connected to the European market or the Western market, it's not good for the country economically.
Wayne Mary, the American Foreign Policy Council. You've mentioned the DCFTA, but would you assess also the impact of the association agreement in general thus far on the reform process?
Okay, I can start.
Okay.
The association agreement has these political and economic parts. In terms of economic part, it will remain probably the same even after the Netherlands referendum. With the political part, we don't know what will happen. It's still kind of in making, in process reconsideration. The economic part doesn't flourish. When I ask my colleagues from economic analytical centers, they say, well, we use as much as we can, but of course the loss of Russian market makes a tremendous negative impact that is not covered by DFSTA. But the political part was extremely important, and here were my competencies. And I was definitely following how implementation of those anti-corruption, for example, anti-corruption demands or how to put it, conditions that were part of this agreement, they were changing our political system in two ways. We already created several new anti-corruption institutions. Very important step. And if they function properly, they will make a very positive impact on society, on government, and also on economics and economy. But there's also this rule: if there is an opportunity to misuse some political institution, it can be misused. They are all in the line of reporting to president. And I don't know if these institutions will work properly this year, but definitely this year they will be used to control power elites in Ukraine. And there's one figure who can control all the power elites. Yanukovych, Kuchma, they never had these strong institutions at hand. So in a way, it's a new situation that association agreement unexpectedly created in our political system. So I'm trying to pay very close attention how they function, if there is any evidence. So far, the risk is there, but there's no evidence that it's misused. So in our monitor, we constantly pay attention to this. So if there's an evidence, we will immediately report about that.
So I'm conscious of our time, and we have about 10, 15 minutes left, and a bunch of people with their hands up. So why don't we take those remaining questions, and then we'll come back to Mikhail and Balázs. Please, you, sir.
Yes, Bogdan Futey. There was a mention about Minsk proposals or Minsk discussions. By the way, the last time I was in Ukraine and I was discussing this with members of parliament, when I mentioned the word Minsk agreements, they were all very critical of me because there is no agreement, they're just discussions. So just for the benefit of everyone. The other thing, and the question that I have, is there an alternative to the Minsk discussions at the present time proposed by any political party or group in Ukraine? So that's my first question. My second question would be, on the existence of the present coalition. Now, there is a new law that has been signed by President Poroshenko, basically, which allows the head of the party to fire or to dismiss members, deputies, if they do not go along or they're critical of the party. And that law already is being challenged by 49 deputies with the Constitutional Court. If the Constitutional Court does not support this aspect, what would be the outcome of the coalition and whether new elections are in order? And the third one I have, I just read
I think
today.
that there are a lot of people waiting,
Well,
though.
okay, but it's very simple. Groisman has asked the Minister of Justice to review the decisions of the various courts. What do you think the outcome of that will be?
Sure. Please.
Okay, thank you very much, George Jelishvili, Georgetown University. I'll abstain from comments and consideration, just focus on questions. First one, has these Panama Papers, which implicated very directly Poroshenko, had any public discourse, any political outcome, any ripple effect, which actually confirms the fact that Poroshenko remains oligarch? And the second, enumerating these political groups, we haven't mentioned for this private sector. Is it still a presence in the Ukrainian politics, and what is the chances of its revival and its fortunes? Thank you.
Then I saw one more hand, please.
Michael McCarthy. My question is, how would you characterize the reform efforts in the defense sector to date? What are the prospects for the future, and how can U.S. and the West help?
So we've got about 6 questions on the table. Maybe we can start with the political ones. Could you talk a little bit? I know in your article you mentioned this idea of the party unity and the button pushing. Could you talk a little bit about the impact of that, and then maybe connect it to the question about the role of the far right and how important they are?
And the first one you wanted?
First, no, if you look at the button pushing and the far right
okay.
Political prospects, I mean, if you could take those two, that would be great.
Well, there's Honorable Fateh, I really respect your input here, because it tackles very important part of what's going on with Ukrainian political system right now. In 2014, the existing political, do you hear me? Yeah. The existing political party system was ruined, and the new parties emerged, and they are very fragile and new structures. Usually it's one-figure parties, very populistic, and Parliament and the leaders of factions and the parties have forced the Parliament and President, well, President himself is very interested, to introduce this new, very Communist Party, Soviet Communist Party experience discipline into new parties. And it's really dangerous because from within, parties are not the place for any kind of discussion. And Parliament under Groisman wasn't the place for discussion either. So we expect with the change of the speaker, probably Parliament will again be the very important place for national dialogue and for discussions. So far, you are right. It was for a very long time excluded for policymaking. Parliament was not a place for discussions, almost as in Duma. Was it Gryzlov probably said?
Gryzlov.
Yeah, Gryzlov coined that Duma is not the place for discussions. In the Parliament, these discussions, instead of this fruitful discussion leading to some policy formulation, they were, since there's lots of blocks and obstacles for dialogue, then they definitely had to use radical politics, and bombing in August was part of the absence of the dialogue in the Parliament. So now the situation has worsened, and I do not expect from Constitutional Court any independent behavior. In recent 5 months, Constitutional Court in Ukraine has proved to be very loyal, obedient to President. And they were the decisions that were made, we just published, Marina Stavnichuk and I, an article showing these inventions, unprecedented inventions of Constitutional Court in terms of their decisions. And immediately after the voting for some very strange decisions, this Constitutional Court, the members of the court go out with their personal opinions. And yeah, well, not always everybody, but sometimes it's majority. And you cannot understand how could you guys then vote for these strange decisions. So we lost our constitutional reform. I didn't say it in the beginning, but constitutional reform is so much delegitimized because of the pressure from one side, from presidential office, that we probably need to restart entire reform once again. And here, the independence of Constitutional Court would be a very important, would be very important, but we don't have it. So probably Parliament will have to reinitiate it. And here the West should probably support us in restarting the constitutional reform. I know that there are many tactical and near ends that are very important, but if we lose constitutional reform, if we will not be able to reconstruct our political system and rebalance the branches of power, I think the fragility of Ukraine will increase tremendously by the end of this year.
Okay.
And Pravy sector.
Yes. And the far right, maybe.
Yeah. Let me just see at the figures once again. Pravy sector is not, as you know, it's not a very popular political force. But it has, I mean, when we have elections, Pravy sector is usually not getting more than 2% of votes. There are several right sector activists who became mayors in small towns, and we receive very strange information from those social experiments that are happening there. But I saw that in Western media it's covered. Dmitro Yarosh, the ex-leader of Pravy sector, has left the party, the core group. He's now independent person with 18% of positive rating, according to recent polls. But Yarosh is now more MP, a parliamentary figure with some radical flavor, and who is more involved, well, allegedly, into coordination of pro-Kolomoisky MPs rather than radical politics. So, you know, sometimes corruption, political corruption, tames even the most radical figures. Sorry for the cynical joke, but looks like that.
It's the Ukrainian way.
But yeah, yes, radical corruption. But there's also some data showing that the former Socialist Specialist Party, now Svoboda Party, is regaining its popularity, and they may return to parliament. But again, the issue of corruption have proved to work on this party very well as well.
Okay, so maybe, Balázs, you spoke a little bit about Minsk before, and that remains, at least in this town, something that everyone talks about and looks to the next round of high-level discussions, and then the question of the sequencing of elections, of how representative the elections can be, of the citizen security to come vote for the IDPs, media access, and the amnesty rules, and the languishing decentralization package. It's obviously a very complicated package, but people are still working on it. And so I'm just sort of, is it something that is an exercise that will lead to anything, or has it exhausted its potential?
Well, you know, like you hear two things, that the Minsk agreement is the only game in town. That's the Western officials are saying, and you're hearing in Kyiv that, you know, we don't want to discuss it even, and that's, you know, kind of the in between two, and there's a lot of resistance, you know, beyond the rhetorics. And again, I just going to repeat myself. I don't see any possibility that Kyiv would agree to implement the Minsk agreement, and one of the reasons is actually the nationalist lingering influence, because they're not going to accept. And the Pravy sector and all these nationalist far-right battalions, real strength is not in the parliament, but in the weapons. Now they fully armed. They part of the army. They part of this. But they making press releases that we're not going to accept any command which we don't like, right? So there is a question of integrity of these things. 2 days ago, one of the battalions, Azov and OUN, another one went to destroy a Soviet monument. And what the police did, nothing. This is not, just went and destroyed, So, this is kind of undermining the legal institutions. And I fully agree here, the Constitution essentially no longer exists in Ukraine, right? Like, just think about the second constitutional vote, which according to the Constitution must be happening in the following parliament, was changed by a procedural vote. How? How a constitutional vote, which requests constitutional majority, was postponed or canceled by a procedural vote with a simple majority. I'm not a lawyer, but I just doesn't right? And we didn't comment on it. Everything was fine. We find a solution, the Ukrainians said, how to avoid the Minsk implementation. And
no, it's still 300.
And nothing
It still needs 300.
Yeah, but still,
yeah.
they just postpone it, and that's it. There's a lot of these kind of things, and unfortunately, this is also showing that the presidential administration is growing strength, and essentially, can deliver the results. The loyalty is the key word when it comes to Poroshenko's governance, and this loyalty, what they're seeking, and that's gonna, what they're gonna use the loyalty for is a question. Whether more reforms or further undermining the. But going back to Minsk, we essentially propose an alternative and restart the new constitutional process. Go to referendum, ask the people. Ukraine can ask its international partners. Wait for a minute. We need to figure out what kind of country we want to be. Otherwise, there's going to be a lot of resistance. We are very fragile. Our people are not going to accept this kind of, backroom deals, which essentially the Minsk agreement was. Right, so Ukraine can come up with an initiative, but instead of this putting out fires, trying to avoid it, and that's what increasing the Western frustration, because the West doesn't see the details, or not necessarily seeing the details, so they might want to take into consideration these details, which is going to be worsening the relationship, sooner or later, or it's already worsening the Western-Ukrainian relationship. So there is a way out. It's just Ukraine has to come up with a solution. With a initiative to move out instead of just a reactionary avoidance of the Minsk agreement. So there was one more question about the defense sector, the defense that I actually want to address. I think we just gave what I found a very balanced assessment, short assessment on the defense reform. But just to, there is certainly, when it comes to the number of troops, when it comes to the equipment, when it comes to the battle readiness, when it comes to the the mobilization and all this, there is a lot of progress in the reform. When it comes, again, equipment, there is one thing which I think it's not. There is the integrity of the troops is a big question for me, remaining question, and the management. And one thing which we were kind of joking sometimes, and when there was a big debate, and it shouldn't be a joke, there was a big debate about whether the U.S. should give weapons to Ukraine, which is one of the biggest weapon producer country in the world, was that, okay, well, pick up your battalion. Which one you want to give it to? And there is one particular case study which I would raise your attention is the radars, which the U.S. essentially provided, and what happened with the 3 radars. Only one exists. One was destroyed by the Ukrainian army, and the third was captured by the rebels. And that is the question of integrity, and that is the question of management, because Poroshenko just named a new head of chief of staff of the army, and is the guy who helped to kind of cover the Debaltsevo losses. He's loyal to Poroshenko. That's the reason and by the way, he was engaged into corruption cases in Kosovo and Iraq with the Ukrainian contingent. That doesn't matter. Merit doesn't matter. Loyalty what matters. Whether he's going to do what Poroshenko wants him to do. So that undermining the army integrity and the management, which is, if you're going to talk to soldiers, this is what they're going to say. These generals are essentially useless. This is not, so there's a lot of protest and a lot of resistance against. So the integrity and the management are the 2 things which we can help with, but at the same time, this is what ultimately the main focus of the reforms should be, and not only in the defense sector.
So I have a last question for Mikhail, which is, the mood in this town has become, as you were alluding to, just tired or impatient, and a sense that the ideal moment has passed and we're now disappointed. Do you think that assessment's wrong, or that people are missing something?
Well, I think there was
Yeah.
too high expectations from Ukraine. If you look at the history of Ukraine, neither Moscow nor Washington nor Brussels would push us to do something that we didn't want to. Well, it's simple. It's a mystery because we are interested in Russian market, in European market. We are interested to be part of European Union. And in spite of that interest, somehow power elites take it over and use usually for just another cycle of self-isolation. It's very cozy for them to self-isolate. So my advice to the West, first of all, please do not expect fast change with us. Our power elites are very volatile. We exist mostly as a setup, as a system of informal institutions. And don't expect our parliament to be parliament or constitutional court to be constitutional court. So maybe some realism in terms of dealing with us is very important. And involvement of opposition is critical. Just because, we are very fast changing our rulers. Please make sure that the next rulers, the next group of rulers are friends of the West. For me as a liberal, it's very important that the next generation of those who will rule Ukraine will also look at the West as friends.
Well, on that optimistic note, I thank you, Mikhail and Bosch.